In the late 18th century, an economist predicted that no matter how much we increased production, we would never become meaningfully richer. Any gains would be swallowed by population growth, and if the population grew too large, famine, disease, and war would bring it back down again. For most of human history, he appeared to be right, and for a time, this idea was incredibly influential among policymakers. So what finally broke this cycle? Broadly speaking, why didn't the average human get richer for thousands of years? In 1798, Thomas Robert Malthus, an English economist and cleric, wrote an essay entitled An Essay on the Principle of Population, which attempted to answer this question. In this essay, he argued that population, if unchecked, tends to grow faster than the food supply, leading to inevitable pressure on resources. As a result, living standards are pushed back towards subsistence through famine, disease, or reduced birth rates. He described the following scenario. We start off as a society with a population of 7 million, and the ability to produce some amount of food, let's call this F1, meaning food at time period 1. Then, the population grows, and that same amount of food, F1, now needs to support 8 million people. This has a few knock-on effects, particularly for the poor. First, these people will of course have less food. Second, the supply of labour has now increased, therefore lowering the price of this labour. In other words, these labourers will now be paid less for their work. Additionally, the increased population results in an increased demand for goods, meaning the price of these goods rises. So the poor will have less to eat, will be paid less for their work, and will have to pay more for provisions. Malthus argued that because these labourers now must work harder to earn the same as they did before, this will result in fewer marriages and a more difficult time raising a family. Therefore, population growth will slow down. At the same time, the reduced price of labour will encourage landowners to hire more labour, to increase the amount of land being farmed, and to increase the productivity of the land that is already being farmed, for example through increased fertilisation. This should result in an increase in food production, giving a total output of F2, where F1 divided by the population at the start equals F2 divided by the new population. Everyone has the same amount of food or income as they had at the start of this cycle. Now that people can live more comfortably, there are no longer the same constraints on marriage and raising a family, and therefore, the cycle repeats itself. According to Malthus, this was one way that the system stabilises. Malthus called the reduction in births preventive checks on population. He also described so-called positive checks. In other words, if preventive checks fail and resources become too scarce, the population will fall due to famine, disease, and war. As you can see, this model was pretty grim. It essentially predicted that no matter how much we increase production, the living standards of the population, at least the majority of the population, would not increase, and these gains in productivity would instead be consumed by a larger population. For much of human history, Malthus's model appeared to describe the world remarkably well. Long-run data suggests that prior to the 19th century, increases in income were typically temporary. Periods of population decline were associated with higher wages, but these gains didn't last. As populations recovered, wages tended to fall again. This pattern was visible to contemporaries of Malthus. Agricultural output depended on land, and land was fixed in quantity. Adding more labour to the same land produced diminishing returns, a mechanism formalised by David Ricardo in his theory of rent. More on him later though. Because of this, Malthus's theory had a significant impact on the political beliefs and the actions of British policymakers. Supporters of Malthus's theory, known as Malthusians, believed that charity to the poor was futile, as this would only result in an increased number of the poor. An example of these beliefs in action is the Poor Law Amendment Act of 1834, under which relief would only be given in workhouses, and conditions in these workhouses were intended to be so awful that only those truly in need of relief would seek assistance from them. These beliefs also shaped how the British government responded to catastrophes. By the mid-1800s, much of the Irish population had become heavily dependent on the potato as a source of food. The crop was hardy, could be grown in poor soil, and was incredibly calorie dense. This was crucial as population growth and the widespread subdivision of land meant that many families were farming increasingly small plots, often just enough to sustain themselves. This was exacerbated by long-standing inequalities in land ownership, rooted in earlier restrictions such as the penal laws, which limited the ability of Catholics to accumulate land. In 1845, a fungus-like microorganism known as blight infected the potato crop. Although this was present elsewhere in Europe and America, in Ireland heavy reliance on a single variety and a cool, wet climate created the perfect conditions for it to spread rapidly. When farmers went to harvest, many of the potatoes were rotten and inedible. As you can imagine, this was disastrous for the population, but it was 1846 where the situation became catastrophic. For a second year in a row, blight destroyed the harvest of potatoes that the Irish relied on. The following year is considered the worst year of the famine, and it came to be known as Black 47. Despite average crop yields in 1847, the previous years had left many without seed potatoes to plant. As a result, many flocked to join public work schemes, which created ideal conditions for the spread of so-called famine fever among the emaciated population. In 1847, public work schemes were briefly replaced by a nationwide system of soup kitchens, which fed millions at their peak. However, this relief was soon withdrawn as policymakers considered it too expensive and believed free aid undermined self-reliance, reverting instead to the harsher workhouse system. As stated previously, conditions in these workhouses were deliberately harsh. Overcrowding, disease, and poor sanitation were widespread. Food was minimal, and families were often separated, with the intention of preventing those who did not need relief from seeking it. Before the famine, the population of Ireland was around 8.5 million. The death toll was around 1 million people, while between 1845 and 1855, at least 2.1 million people left the island, mostly for the UK and America. The population of Ireland continued to fall all the way to 1931, dropping to just over 4 million. It has still never fully recovered, standing at roughly 7 million people today. Malthus stated, "To give full effect to the natural resources of the country, a great part of the population should be swept from the soil." It's important to note that Malthus was heavily criticised by many of his contemporaries and later economists. For instance, Malthus and David Ricardo had heated back and forth discussions. In these discussions, Ricardo argued that economic dynamics were more complex and shaped by distribution and production, not just population pressure. Their disagreement was one of the central debates in early political economy. Criticism was particularly strong in the context of Ireland. Writers such as Whitley Stokes and George Ensor rejected the idea that poverty in Ireland was driven by excessive population. Instead, they argued that the problem lay in governance, land distribution, and economic structure. In this view, poverty was not the result of natural law, but of political and institutional failure. Similar arguments were made by William Hazlitt, who criticised Malthus for confusing the physical limits of production with the unequal distribution of resources within society. These are just some of the many criticisms that Malthusianism has faced over the years, but I just wanted to clarify that although his beliefs were adopted by many politicians and policymakers, there was not a consensus around these beliefs. Malthus focused heavily on the fixed quantity of land, which in fairness is understandable given what he knew at the time. But he overlooked another major constraint: nitrogen. Nitrogen is an essential element for plant growth. Although it makes up about 78% of the Earth's atmosphere, this isn't usable by plants because it exists as nitrogen gas, which is chemically very stable and must first be converted into a usable form such as ammonia or nitrates. In Malthus's time, farmers recycled what nitrogen they could, using manure and crop rotation to restore soil fertility. But these methods were tied to the amount of land and livestock available. They could not keep up with sustained population growth. In the 19th century, countries began importing nitrogen in the form of guano, bird droppings mined from islands off the coast of South America, where the droppings had accumulated for centuries and hardened into dense deposits. It was so valuable that the United States went on a spree claiming remote Pacific islands to secure supply. Although this was helpful, it didn't really solve the problem. Guano was a finite resource, and extraction and transport were costly. Global agriculture remained constrained by the natural supply of nitrogen. If you're enjoying the video so far, consider supporting the channel by liking and subscribing. In 1918, a man named Fritz Haber was awarded the Nobel Prize in Chemistry. Despite not being a household name, his discoveries are directly responsible for about half of the nitrogen in your body, and without him, it's estimated that the global population would be about half of what it is today. He had discovered how to create ammonia from hydrogen and atmospheric nitrogen under conditions of high temperature and pressure. He, along with another man named Carl Bosch, commercialized the process, which became known as the Haber-Bosch process. For the first time in human history, we were no longer limited by the natural supply of nitrogen. We could produce it artificially at scale. The same land that could once feed 7 million people could now feed about 14 million people. Many of you may be asking why the same process doesn't just repeat itself. Now that production could increase massively, why didn't the population grow exponentially until we were back at subsistence levels? Well, for a while it looked like it might. In the 1900s, the global population exploded. In 1900, the global population was about 1.6 billion people. By 2000, it was 6.1 billion. However, as incomes rose and healthcare improved, a dynamic that Malthus did not foresee began to occur. As child mortality declined and the chances of children surviving into adulthood increased, families began to have fewer children, not more. At the same time, children became more expensive to raise and educate, and less economically necessary. Instead of having many children, families began to invest more in fewer children through education, health, and other skills. This is known as the demographic transition. The population continues to grow for a time, but eventually stabilizes, even as incomes continue to rise. Increases in productivity now translated into sustained improvements in living standards, rather than being absorbed by population growth. So in some respects, Malthus wasn't entirely wrong. In fact, for most of human history, he appeared to be right. Living standards were constrained, and any gains were temporary. What he didn't foresee was that technology could change the constraints we faced. Once we learned how to produce nitrogen at scale, the limits he described were no longer binding. Modern economic growth models build this idea in. They treat technology not as fixed, but as something that evolves, accumulates, and compounds over time. And as long as technological progress outpaces population growth, living standards can, at least in theory, continue to rise. As you can see, this is a morally complex topic. Malthus truly believed that population growth would inevitably lead to hardship, and that limiting it could reduce suffering. But in practice, these ideas were sometimes used to justify policies that were harsh and at times deeply inhumane. I'm an economist, not a philosopher, and therefore I'm not going to go any further into the ethics here. But it's worth keeping in mind that economic ideas shape policy decisions that can affect the lives of millions of people, and this underscores the importance of empirical work carried out by economists, some of which I have covered in other videos. I hope you enjoyed the video, and if you did, you might also enjoy this video about what really ended the transatlantic slave trade, or this video about what the Dutch East India Company can teach us about the new space race. Thanks for watching, and hopefully I'll see you next time on Econ Unpacked.